Hey everyone, Steven here, and welcome to my little library of horrors. So after finishing my last book, Cover by Jack Ketchum, I really wanted to try something that I see a lot of people talk about, but something that I have never gone out of my way personally to try. And that is to read a book that the weather is the current season that we are in real life. Unfortunately, that's winter right now, which is my least favorite season, but yeah, like I said, I've never been against the idea of doing that. It's just something that never really crossed my mind or had any real urgency to it. But, it kind of honestly gave me a reason to go ahead and pick a book that I've been eyeing since I bought it. And I kind of held off reading until it was winter. So yeah, that book is Winter Chill by Joanne Fluke. Go ahead and get a look at that cover right there. Beautiful cover. Unfortunately, the artist is not credited, but I really love seeing the sled through the perspective of the inside of a house. You see the window frames right here. I love the inclusion of a sled, a really unique item you don't really see in covers. So yeah, beautiful cover. How's the story? Well, before I get into that, please feel free to drop a like on the video. It helps spread awareness and helps it reach other potential readers. So yeah, if you could just drop a quick like, I would really super appreciate it. So, Winter Chill by Joanne Fluke was actually written and published by Dell Publishing in June of 1984. Kind of weird, honestly, a book sent in Colorado during winter time, and it's published in beginning of summer. But, so what's Winter Chill about? Essentially, Winter Chill tells the story of this small Colorado town that is suddenly plagued by this outbreak of accidents, essentially. It starts off with our main characters, which, excuse me, let me check my notes. We have Dan Larsen, Marian Larsen, and Laura Larsen. So they are essentially the three main characters of the book. So it starts off pretty intense, to be honest. It starts with Dan and Laura getting into a snowmobile accident. A pretty gruesome one, as a matter of fact. And unfortunately, Laura dies, and Dan becomes paralyzed from the legs down. So that, in turn, brings in Marian. Now, Marian is she's a very complex character in the sense that I shouldn't even say complex. She's what's the word? I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but a tragic character. She's a very tragic character. That's what I'm looking for. She essentially is now the pillar of her marriage. When she gets to the hospital, they're explaining, Dr. Hinckley is explaining to Laura how Dan's paralysis is, excuse me, still sick. Dan's paralysis is psychological paralysis. Essentially, Dan's blaming himself for the death of their daughter, and it's somehow blocking the neurological pathways to his legs to where he can't feel them, he can't move them, but his spine isn't broken, he has nothing physically that's keeping him from walking. So essentially, in the matter of an instant, Marian's life is completely turned upside down. The ending of the hospital scene is just it genuinely almost brought me to tears, because it was very heavy, where, Marian's just sort of, you know what, I need to get a breather, let me get my head clear. She goes to the vending machine and she just makes this idle thought, oh, I'll get one of these because they're Laura's favorite. And it's in that moment right there where it really hits her that her daughter is dead and her husband could possibly be paralyzed the rest of his life. And it all just kind of comes shattering down on her, and it's hard. it's definitely very emotional, very difficult to read, but I think does a wonderful job of setting the groundwork of her and Dan's character arc throughout the story. Excuse me. So that essentially is kind of like the catalyst of the story. Is their daughter dies, Dan is paralyzed, and now Marian has to essentially learn to pick her life back up and completely start over. So as the story goes on, it takes its time to show the effects of a child's death in a marriage. Not even just so much a marriage, in a parent's life. Like I personally have no idea what I would do if I ever lost one of my children. I, knock on wood, thankfully may never have to deal with that issue. But we can see like a lot of, obviously there's a lot of tension between Dan and Marian. It's interesting to see like how it's almost like people are forcing Marian to grieve at a pace that's not her own. Like people are pushing her. She's a teacher, so you have to go back to work. It'll help you clear your mind. And, oh, we're having this party over here. Why don't you come join us for this? And da-da-da. Excuse me. And it shows a lot of how it's like that old saying goes, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's, people are trying to be helpful and there for Marian, but it ends up being extremely overwhelming for her. And, it's sort of, I think it sort of kind of not strengthens her mentality. As a matter of fact, I think it further damages it to where she has to kind of like push things in the back of her head before she's ready to do. And the same thing happens with Dan. Is, he is the coach of the hockey team of their school, and, he's the best they've had in years, and people are pushing him to get back to work and, because it'll make him feel better. But it's interesting to see from Dan's point of view where he now all of a sudden, with not only blaming himself for the death of his daughter, is now struggling with the thought of essentially being half a man. He's no longer able to provide for his wife, be it physically, monetarily, even at some points emotionally. Dan really struggles with the guilt of his daughter's death because in a way it's, him and Laura were supposed to start heading home, but Laura had begged for one more ride during the snowstorm, and Dan was like, all right, one more ride. And that's how everything sort of came to be. And so it's definitely interesting to kind of get into Dan's mind, which the author does a wonderful job of every character in the book. She takes the time to dive into the character's psyche, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how their thought process works. I think a lot of the times, when writers are trying to tell a story, it's a fine balance between action and character development. So it's like, I think there's this fear of being too boring, but focusing on character development and things like that. So it kind of gets pushed to the wayside. Whereas this, the pacing is very slow. I'll be totally honest. The pacing is extremely slow after the first chapter. But as I said, it takes the time to not just focus on the horrific incident and, the further accidents that are happening around town. It takes the time to show the toll of what a person goes through when they're going through the loss of a child. And I think that's extremely important in any book. Make the reader care about your characters. I've always said it. Anytime I've talked about books to people is, if I don't care about this person at all, why would I care what happens to them? Like, you could have a really interesting character, but if I know nothing about them other than, hey, this person's here, this is how they are, I'm inclined a little less to kind of build that bond outside of them being a character on a piece of paper. But anyway, after all that, Dan essentially starts to struggle with seeing Marian falling apart. She's really struggling, crying a lot. Obviously, of course. So one day, Marian opens a book that she hasn't touched in forever, and out falls a note from their daughter that says, I love you, Mom. And, that kind of helps lift Marian's mood. She's suddenly back to her old self and is doing this and cooking and that. So when she starts to come back on the downslope, Dan, again, still struggling with how to be there for his wife, decides to fake a note from Laura and put it in another book. And, so he calls Marian over and is just like, hey, can you pass me that book over there? And another note falls out. And Marian's ecstatic at first, and Dan's like, oh, great, maybe this will help get her in a better mood. But Marian points out, this note is new. You know what I mean? So she then convinces herself Laura is contacting her from the other side. And which brings Dan to this dilemma of, I'm lying to my wife, but, this is the happiest I've seen her since the accident. And so, if I tell her, not only do I bring her world crashing back down, I've now essentially kind of destroyed any trust we have with each other now. Well, at least that my wife has in me. So, Marian essentially becomes obsessed with these letters. She waits and, she starts to sleep in Laura's room and organizes Laura's room and leaves her diary open and, is just waiting for another letter at this point. And, again, that just further builds more and more and more tension between Dan and Marian, because Dan knows the truth, but is still struggling with, do I tell my wife the truth, or do I just continue to let her indulge in this fantasy? So, shortly after that is when Laura's friend, Becky Fisher, is found dead in an abandoned ice house, which suddenly, starts to spark a rumor within town that the kids are being murdered. So we're introduced to Sheriff Bates, obviously the sheriff of the small town. He's never had to deal with a murder before or anything like that. He's still not fully convinced it's murder, but, his whole world is starting to kind of turn upside down now as well. And then the final person to die is Jenny Powell. So the Larsens have their best friends, Ronnie and Sally Powell. So they're their best adult friends. Their kids were best friends, Jenny and Laura. So Jenny dies as well. So now it suddenly becomes this massive manhunt where the town is convinced there's a murder going on. There's a murderer running around the town. And, but while these murders are happening, Marian's telling Dan, hey, this is wonderful because I've been seeing Laura in my dreams, and she keeps telling me how lonely she is. And, now she's got her friends with her. This is great. And, so that really sets off Dan's triggers for a specific reason. And that's because after the second murder, you know, Dan is starting to realize, like, well, he's starting to think that it very well could possibly be Marian killing the kids because he says that Marian used to sleep right. So he would say, she would be in her sleep and like write down random poems, random sentences, things like that. So he's convinced that Marian is writing these letters to herself while she's asleep and is slowly convincing herself, she is speaking with their dead daughter. And so, like I said, Marian's completely convinced that Laura is writing to her, that it's her. And, but she is not her, but Dan, the author also strings along the mystery of Dan has these dreams of walking. And when he wakes up, his legs are sore as if he'd been walking for hours. But during his sleep, Marian would also be gone from the house. By when he wakes up, she would just be coming in. So it's this really interesting mystery strung throughout the book of, is Marian actually going out and killing the kids thinking, that's what her daughter wants? Or is Dan's subconscious causing him to go out and kill these children out of spite and jealousy that they're alive and Laura isn't? So it's really a really brilliant string through the story. It's constantly keeping you guessing. But yeah, essentially the story ends, and I wasn't sure how I felt about the ending. I kind of sat on it a while, but the more I thought about it, the more I really enjoyed it. Like, it has your typical, I don't want to say typical horror ending. That sounds bad. But it has an ending that fits what the story should have been, is what I'm trying to say. Like, it's a good horror ending. Not typical, but it fits. It's a really fitting ending. So yeah, basically, overall positives, great cast of characters, excellent mystery strewn throughout. It does a really brilliant job of showcasing grief and, grief and trying to build your life back up after a tragic accident, all that good stuff. The negative side, I would say the pacing is definitely a little slow. It kind of feels a little repetitive at times in the beginning, where it's like, okay, they wake up, they get into a fight, they make up, they go to bed. They wake up, they get into a fight, they make up, they go to bed. So it's a little bit like that until, honestly, right around past the 100-page mark is when, it really starts to pick up the pace and everything. And the author has some kind of obsession with exclamation points. Not that that's so much like a point against it. It's more of like a nitpick for me. But like, I remember counting 8 exclamation points on one page. And that's just extremely excessive to me. I mean, like there was even one instance that really was glaring to me, because I think the way that specific chapter ended, had the author put an ellipses at the end of the statement, it would have made that chapter end on a really menacing, okay, I gotta know what's gonna happen next note, rather than the way she did it with the exclamation point, where it's just like, ah! And it's like, okay, why would this person be exclaiming that? That's kind of weird. But yeah, as far as that's kind of the nitpicks for me, as far as the story goes. But I guess the overall message that I personally took away from the book is you need to be open with your partner. I think that's kind of what the author was trying to portray here is, oftentimes, especially with men, we try to be this stone pillar of support and toughness. and stoicism, that it can sometimes lead our partners to think we're lacking emotion, that we're not sympathetic. You know what I mean? It's almost, it comes off as if we don't care. And, that's never a good thing in a relationship. My wife and I have been together for 13 years, and we've had some extremely difficult conversations, really, really hard ones, conversations I thought we would never have to have, but we've had them. And yes, it's painful in the moment, absolutely. But, like I said, we've been together for 13 years, and I think our communication has been a big proponent of that. So that's kind of how I felt between Dan and Marian in the story is, I understand Dan's intentions with making the first note, but when it really started to kind of like get rolling with the second note and everything, I think that would have been the time for Dan to kind of just be honest. Yeah, I wrote the note. I wanted to make you feel better. I didn't know what else to do. I hurt seeing you hurt. And again, I'm sure Marian would be devastated by that. But to me personally, I think that's better than holding someone up with false hope. I think the crash afterwards, when they do eventually find out the truth, is much more hurtful than if you're just to be straight out honest, even after the first mistake. But yeah, like I said, overall message, talk with each other. Be honest with each other. Have difficult conversations with each other. It's part of a relationship. It's not, love isn't always laughing and good times and all this other stuff. Love is work, and they take sacrifice, and sometimes you have to, sacrifice your own, I guess, good intentions to have the right intentions. There's good intentions, and then I think there's the right intentions. But yeah, overall, guys, like especially guys, even especially if there's any younger guys, in your teens or your early 20s, anything watching, you don't have to be a brick wall when it comes to your emotions. You can cry, you can be sad, you can be upset. We're human. We are human, and we need that. If we don't, hurt turns to pain, pain turns to anger, anger turns to hatred. And that's essentially how we get it out in the end, is through our hatred. And nobody wins in the end of that. If you're with the right person, they'll never make you feel bad for crying or showing emotions. Do it. Be healthy. Take care of yourself. Take care of your partner. And have those tough conversations. But overall, I'm going to give Winter Chill a 4 out of 5. I really liked it. I thought it was really well-paced. Not well-paced, excuse me. I thought it was a little slow-paced. But again, I love the overall story and mystery throughout the book. I really enjoyed it. And I would be up to reading more of this person's work. Little trivia about the author before I sign off here, though. Apparently she wrote a lot of Hallmark movies. And I guess I can kind of see that in the book. I was kind of throwing around the term Hallmark horror for this kind of story. Not that it's a bad thing. Like I said, horror doesn't constantly have to be this constant, flashing of gore and violence and monsters and all this stuff. You can have a good slow burn. You can have a horror story that's not drenched in gore and tons of monsters and violence and things like that. You can have one that kind of almost puts that on the back burner while, showcasing a deeper meaning behind the horror. But yeah, Winter Chill by Joanne Fluke. Definitely go check it out. I loved it. And hopefully her next book's just as good. But that's going to be it for me today, everybody. I really appreciate you watching, checking out all my videos, and just spending some time with me. I know time is precious, and the fact that any of you decide to just take some of that time to sit with me and listen to me rant means everything to me. I really appreciate it. But yeah, leave a comment down below, and subscribe for future book reviews. Until then, take care, everybody. See ya.